Chief Daniel Morgan had seen his fair share of criminals, burglars, drug dealers, con artists. But nothing in his 25 years of law enforcement prepared him for the absurdity that was about to unfold. It was a crisp Sunday morning in Silver Creek, a quiet suburban neighborhood where people prided themselves on their manicured lawns and pristine driveways. Daniel, 52 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, was enjoying his rare day off. Sitting on his porch with a steaming cup of black coffee, he let the peaceful sounds of birds chirping wash over him. For once, there were no emergencies, no pressing cases, just him, his coffee, and the newspaper. Then, bang, 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 the sudden aggressive pounding on his front door shattered the moment like a gunshot. His instincts kicked in immediately. Years on the force taught him that knocks like that usually meant trouble. He set his coffee down, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the door. When he opened it, he was met with a sight so ridiculous, he almost laughed. 3 men stood on his porch, puffing out their chests in cheap, ill-fitting uniforms. Their leader, a stocky man with a thick mustache and mirrored sunglasses, flashed a badge that looked like something from a toy store. "Mr. Morgan, step outside immediately!" the man barked. Daniel folded his arms. "And who exactly are you?" The mustached man adjusted his belt, standing taller as if to assert dominance. "We're with the Silver Creek Community Compliance Division," he declared. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Community Compliance Division? He had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade and never heard of such a thing. The man nodded. "That's correct. You have violated several neighborhood ordinances, and we're here to bring you in." Daniel bit back a smirk. He had encountered all sorts of criminals, but this was a new one. "All right," he said, crossing his arms. "Let's hear it. What exactly am I charged with?" One of the lackeys, a lanky guy with a nervous twitch, fumbled with a clipboard. He cleared his throat and read in an exaggeratedly official voice. "You have been cited for an unauthorized mailbox, failure to submit landscaping modifications for approval, and an illegal driveway expansion." Daniel turned to glance at his mailbox. It was standard issue, black, and in perfect condition. His lawn, neatly trimmed, his driveway, the same one he had for years. "So let me get this straight," Daniel said slowly. "You're trying to arrest me over a mailbox in my own driveway?" "Non-compliance isn't tolerated," Mustache Man snapped. Daniel sighed. These guys were serious. "And where exactly are you taking me?" The mustached man lifted his chin. "To our community compliance holding facility." Daniel almost laughed. "The HOA has a jail now?" "It's a compliance center," the man corrected, clearly annoyed. Daniel pinched the bridge of his nose, taking a deep breath. He had 2 options: play along or end this nonsense right now. He decided to play. "All right, boys. If you're going to arrest me, go ahead and do it." He turned slightly, lowering his hands as if surrendering. Mustache Man smirked. "That's more like it." The lanky lackey pulled out a cheap pair of plastic handcuffs, the kind that looked like they'd snap if he sneezed too hard. He reached for Daniel's wrist, and that's when Daniel moved. In one swift motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and spun him toward the nearest pillar on his porch. The lackey let out a startled yelp as his clipboard went flying. Mustache Man took a step back, eyes widening. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Daniel kept his hold firm. "Performing a citizen's arrest." Before Mustache Man could react, Daniel reached down to his hip, not for a weapon, but for his radio. With a quick press of a button, he sent out a silent distress signal to his deputies, all without breaking eye contact. Then, in the distance, sirens. The fake officers froze. Daniel leaned in close to the man he had pinned. Now, let's talk about who's really under arrest. The piercing sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. The fake officers exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling. Mustache Man clenched his jaw, his mirrored sunglasses slipping down his nose as he struggled to maintain control of the situation. "This is unnecessary," he barked. "We have full jurisdiction over this neighborhood. You're interfering with an official HOA operation." Daniel smirked. "Last I checked, impersonating law enforcement was a crime. And so is attempting an unlawful detainment." Just then, 2 police cruisers skidded to a stop in front of Daniel's house. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, drawing the attention of several curious neighbors who peeked out from behind curtains and doorways. Deputy Claire Lawson stepped out first, her expression shifting from concern to amused disbelief as she took in the scene. Her police chief holding a man against a pillar, while 2 other so-called officers stood frozen in place. "Chief," she said, adjusting her utility belt, "you mind telling me why you're wrestling with a guy who looks like he bought his uniform from a thrift store?" Daniel finally let go of the lackey, who stumbled backward, clutching his arm. "These fine gentlemen were in the middle of an illegal arrest," Daniel explained. "Figured I'd return the favor." Claire took a step forward, arms crossed. "All right, let's see some IDs." Mustache Man puffed up his chest again, trying to reclaim his authority. "There's no need for that. We are HOA compliance officers, and we were enforcing community rules." Claire slowly reached out, plucking the man's shiny badge from his uniform. She turned it over, reading the poorly engraved letters aloud. "Neighborhood compliance agent. Wow, sounds real official," she scoffed. "Where'd you get this, EBAY?" The second lackey, a short man with a receding hairline, took a nervous step forward. "It's legitimate. We were granted full authority by the HOA board." Daniel tilted his head. "Authority to do what exactly? Extort homeowners? Issue fake citations? Arrest people over mailbox colors?" Mustache Man's face turned an alarming shade of red. "We were just enforcing the rules." Claire let out a low whistle. "Well, let's take a look at your official vehicle." One of the officers walked over to the black SUV parked in front of Daniel's house, its side plastered with a decal that read, "Silver Creek HOA Patrol." He opened the door and rummaged inside. Moments later, he let out a whistle. Well, we've got ticket books, fine notices, and a cash box." Daniel turned back to Mustache Man. "So you're running an HOA, or a shakedown operation?" The fake officer swallowed hard. We were just following orders." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Whose orders?" The mustached man hesitated, then mumbled, "The HOA board." Daniel and Claire exchanged knowing looks. "Looks like we have a few more people to visit today." Daniel stood tall as the fake officers shrank under the weight of their lies. The flashing lights of the police cruisers cast a harsh glow on their faces, exposing their fear. The gathered neighbors murmured among themselves, some clutching HOA violation notices they had received in recent weeks. Deputy Claire rifled through the contents of the confiscated cash box, whistling. "Chief, you're gonna love this. We've got hundreds, no, thousands of dollars in here. Looks like they've been collecting fines for a while." Daniel clenched his jaw. "How many people did you scam?" Mustache Man shifted uncomfortably. "It was all legal. The HOA board gave us full authorization to issue citations and collect payments." Claire held up a stack of receipts. And what exactly were you guys doing with all this cash? Because I'm not seeing any of it going back into the community." The second lackey stammered, "The board. The board promised us a cut if we ensured compliance." Daniel exhaled sharply. This was worse than he thought. It wasn't just a group of wannabe cops playing dress-up. This was organized fraud. He turned to the crowd. "How many of you have paid these fines?" Hands went up. A woman in her 60s stepped forward, her voice shaking. "They told me my garden decorations weren't approved and fined me $300. When I refused, they threatened to put a lien on my home." A younger man added, "They hit me for $500 last month. Said my driveway had excessive oil stains. I had just changed my car's oil." A murmur of outrage spread through the crowd. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about an entire neighborhood being extorted. Daniel turned back to the mustached man. His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "You impersonated law enforcement. You illegally detained residents. You stole money? And you expect me to believe the HOA board signed off on this?" The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. Daniel turned to Claire. "We need to have a chat with the HOA board." Claire grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." Daniel and his deputies arrived at the Silver Creek HOA headquarters, a pristine office building nestled within the neighborhood's gated community. Word had already spread, and the board members were waiting for them, some looking nervous, others still trying to maintain an air of control. At the center of it all stood Richard Evers, the HOA president, dressed in an expensive suit that fit a little too perfectly for a man who claimed his position was voluntary. He clasped his hands together, his expression calm but calculated. "Sheriff Morgan," Richard greeted smoothly, his voice oozing faux professionalism. "I assume this is all a misunderstanding." Daniel didn't break stride as he approached. "The only misunderstanding here is that you thought you could get away with this." He tossed a thick folder onto the conference table, its contents spilling out. Fake citations, fraudulent fines, and a list of homeowners who had been threatened or extorted. Richard didn't even blink. "We were simply ensuring that community standards were upheld. Homeowners agree to these rules when they move in." Daniel leaned in slightly, his voice dangerously calm. "Rules don't include sending untrained goons to intimidate people into paying fake fines." A silver-haired woman, Margaret Langley, one of the senior board members, scoffed. "Our officers were just volunteers. They were keeping order in the neighborhood." Claire smirked, holding up a ledger they had pulled from the fake officer's SUV. "Funny, because it looks like these volunteers were pocketing thousands of dollars in fines, and you were giving them a percentage, weren't you?" The room fell silent. Richard's fingers twitched slightly, his mask of control slipping for just a second. "You have no proof of that," he said, his voice tighter now. Daniel held up another document. "Actually, we do. We traced multiple payments made from the HOA's general fund directly to the personal accounts of your enforcement officers. Care to explain why?" Margaret stiffened. We simply incentivized them to ensure compliance." Daniel let out a slow exhale. "Let me make this real simple for you. What you've been running here isn't compliance, it's fraud, it's extortion, and it's illegal." Richard's face darkened. "Surely there's a way to handle this internally. There's no need to involve law enforcement." Daniel chuckled darkly. Too late for that. Claire stepped forward, handcuffs glinting in the overhead light. "Richard Evers, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and financial misconduct." Richard's smug expression finally shattered. "You can't do this!" he sputtered. "I have lawyers. I have—" Daniel cut him off. "Then I suggest you call them. You're going to need one." As Richard Evers and his accomplices were led out in handcuffs, the tension inside the HOA office was palpable. Some board members exchanged frantic whispers, while others stared at the floor, their carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of their exposed corruption. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he stepped outside into the cool evening air. A small crowd of residents had gathered, waiting for news. The moment they saw Richard being loaded into the back of a squad car, a wave of mixed emotions spread through them. Shock, satisfaction, and a deep sense of vindication. An older man in a golf cap stepped forward, his voice heavy with frustration. "Sheriff, you mean to tell me we've been getting scammed this whole time?" Daniel nodded. "Afraid so. Every fine you paid, every threat you received, it was all part of their operation. None of it was legal." A younger woman with a toddler on her hip clenched her jaw. "They told me if I didn't pay a $700 fine for having unapproved window blinds, they'd put a lien on my house." A murmur of outrage rippled through the crowd. Daniel held up a hand. "Listen, I know you're all angry, and you have every right to be. But here's the good news. This stops today. Anyone who was forced to pay these fake fines, keep your receipts. The county prosecutor is already preparing a case, and we're making sure you get your money back." The older man let out a breath of relief. "About damn time." Claire leaned in slightly. "Chief, you should hear this." She handed Daniel a fresh report that had just come through the system. His eyes narrowed as he read it. "Well, well, well," Daniel muttered. He looked up at the crowd. Turns out Richard wasn't just running a fraud operation. He was skimming money from HOA dues, too. Hundreds of thousands. While you all were getting fined for ridiculous things, he was lining his pockets. The golf cap man whistled. "That son of a—" Daniel smirked. "The county's moving forward with felony charges. Looks like Richard and his little enforcement team won't just be losing their HOA positions. They'll be losing their freedom, too." A woman with gray hair and sharp eyes stepped forward. "Sheriff Morgan, I've lived here for 20 years, and I've never seen justice like this. Thank you." Daniel glanced around at the faces before him, hard-working people who just wanted to live in peace, without fear of harassment from those who thought they were above the law. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but also responsibility. "This is what I signed up for," he said simply. Claire nudged him with a grin. "You know, Chief, you just became the most popular man in Silver Creek." Daniel chuckled. "Let's just get this neighborhood back to normal first." As the squad cars carrying Richard Evers and his accomplices disappeared into the night, the atmosphere in Silver Creek shifted. The tension that had hung over the neighborhood for years had finally cracked, replaced by something rare: hope. Residents lingered in small groups, recounting horror stories of harassment, unfair fines, and intimidation tactics. Some laughed in disbelief at how ridiculous it all was, while others still fumed at the injustice they had suffered. Daniel watched them, arms crossed, listening. This wasn't just about one corrupt HOA board. This was about power, about people who thought they could control others simply because no one had ever challenged them before. An elderly woman approached him, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been afraid to speak up for so long," she admitted. "Every time I questioned them, I got another fine. They made me feel like I didn't belong in my own home." Daniel met her gaze. "You belong here more than they ever did." A young man with a baseball cap stepped forward. Sheriff, is there anything stopping this from happening again? What if a new board tries the same thing? Daniel nodded. It was a fair concern. This neighborhood needs real oversight, not a group of self-appointed enforcers with a God complex. I'm working with county officials to make sure this HOA is restructured and any future board members are held accountable. Claire added, and if anyone tries something like this again, you call us, immediately. A cheer erupted from the crowd. Someone popped open a beer and handed it to Daniel, who raised it with a grin. To Silver Creek finally being free. The residents toasted, the tension melting into something lighter. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now standing tall, sharing their stories openly. For the first time in years, Silver Creek felt like a community again. As the celebration continued, Claire nudged Daniel. You know, you've done more for this neighborhood in one day than that board did in years. Daniel smirked. Let's just say they picked the wrong house to mess with. Claire laughed. No kidding. But seriously, Chief, you ever thought about running for mayor? Daniel nearly choked on his drink. Not a chance. I like catching criminals too much. The old man in the golf cap grinned. Well, if you change your mind, you've got my vote. Daniel shook his head, chuckling. Let's just enjoy this victory for now. As he looked out at the sea of relieved, smiling faces, he realized something. This wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about protecting the people who lived under it. And tonight, justice had truly been served. Power in the wrong hands is dangerous. Whether it's in a government office, a corporate boardroom, or a small neighborhood association. People like Richard Evers and his fake enforcement squad thrived on intimidation, using fear to control those who didn't know any better. But their mistake was assuming no one would fight back. The truth is, corruption can exist anywhere. But it only survives when people stay silent. The residents of Silver Creek had spent years living in fear, paying fines they didn't owe, following rules that didn't make sense, until one person stood up. Daniel Morgan didn't just expose a scam. He reminded an entire community that they had a voice. And once they realized their collective strength, they refused to be bullied anymore. This story isn't just about one corrupt HOA. It's about standing up to injustice, no matter how big or small. Because the moment you stop letting fear control you, the people in power lose all of theirs. This situation isn't just fiction. It happens in real life all the time. HOA boards, landlords, and even local governments can abuse their authority if no one holds them accountable. If you ever find yourself facing unfair treatment, know your rights, read contracts, research local laws, and document everything. Speak up. If something feels wrong, question it. Authorities rely on silence to stay in power. Gather support. One voice can be ignored, but a community demanding justice is impossible to silence. Call for legal intervention. If someone is abusing their authority, law enforcement or legal action may be necessary. At the end of the day, power belongs to the people who refuse to back down. The question is, will you stand up when the time comes? Have you ever dealt with an overreaching HOA or an unfair authority figure? Share your story in the comments. Down, down.